What is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is made up of all the living and non-living things in an area. This includes all of the plants, animals, and other living things that make up the communities of a life in an area. An ecosystem also includes non-living materials. For example, water, rocks, soil, and sand. A swamp, a prairie, an ocean, and a forest are examples of ecosystems. An ecosystem usually contains many different kinds of life. A grassland, for example, is an ecosystem that contains more than just grass. It includes other plants, mammals, insects, earthworms, and many tiny living things in the soil. Here are 3 roles it says. Food chain. I can see a food chain. Our producers make the food. Our primary consumer, our squirrel eats that food. Our secondary consumer, that animal eats the animal that eats the food. And the decomposers, right? The fungi, the bacteria, the earthworms, so they're breaking everything down. And over here, and then what we break down, it looks like it gives nutrients to the soil, which makes that initial food. And over here, we have our food web. So you can see the grasshopper eats the food. The coyote eats the grasshopper, and maybe the snake, and the hawk, and the snake eats the hawk, and the hawk eats the squirrel, and the coyote eats the squirrel, and it's a big web of who eats who. But what do we need for sure is the sun and the plants and the dirt, and then the decomposers to make nutrients for the soil for the plants. And we all need air, right? So we definitely need our plants. They're very important. It says, our caption reads, this graphic shows how a single food chain is linked in a group of food chains. Together, they make a food web. Each living thing in an ecosystem has a role to play as a producer, a consumer, or a decomposer. Green plants are producers. They make their own food through a process called photosynthesis. Animals, including humans, are consumers. They eat or consume plants or other animals. Bacteria and other living things that cause decay are decomposers. That was right here. Are decomposers. Decomposers break down the waste products and dead tissue of plants and animals. They return nutrients to the soil where new plants grow. The way that producers, consumers, and decomposers provide nutrients for one another is called a food chain. And we see that right here. Feeding levels. A food chain describes the sequence in which matter and energy move through the feeding levels of an ecosystem. The levels of a food chain are essentially the same across all ecosystems. The first level is the producers. After that is the consumers. Sometimes consumers are further divided into primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. That's the third level. The final link in all food chains is the decomposers, which break down dead organisms and natural waste. The consumers at the top feeding level of a food chain are called top predators. They have no predators. Instead, their population size is controlled through competition. Energy flow. Here's our energy pyramid. We have our producers, and that is eaten by our primary consumers. And some of that energy is lost from our initial producer. And then our secondary consumers, so they eat the rabbits that got energy from the plant. And then the hawk eats the snake that ate the rabbit that got energy from the plant. So it looks like at each level, a little bit of energy is lost from that initial first level of energy that was obtained from the sun. An energy pyramid is a model that shows the flow of energy from one feeding level to the next. The main source of energy in almost all ecosystems is the sun's energy. As energy moves through the ecosystem, much of it is lost at each feeding level as heat. This is the main reason why few food chains have more than 5 feeding levels. Diagrams called energy pyramids are used to depict the flow of energy from one feeding level to the next in a food chain. Most ecosystems have more than one food chain. Food chains overlap and connect to form a food web. Recycling nutrients. Water, carbon, nitrogen, and other elements constantly circulate through an ecosystem. Carbon and oxygen from carbon dioxide, as well as nutrients from soil, enter into plant tissues. When consumers eat the plants, the nutrients enter the consumer's tissues. Consumers that are eaten transfer the nutrients onto the predator at the next feeding level. Consumers that are not eaten die and transfer nutrients in their decaying tissues to the decomposers that feed on them, all the worms in the dirt. The decomposers recycle these nutrients back into the ecosystem. They transfer the nutrients back into the soil and air, where the nutrients become available to the producers, the plants. A delicate balance. An ecosystem's health depends on a delicate balance among all of its members and the environment. If something disturbs the balance, the ecosystem and all its members might suffer. Natural things can disturb ecosystems, including a climate change and natural disasters. Human activities that can disturb ecosystems that include polluting and clearing land for farms and buildings. Humans are also responsible for many invasive species. An invasive species is a living thing that spreads through an ecosystem where it did not exist before. Invasive species can threaten the plants and animals that originally made up that ecosystem. For example, Burmese pythons were brought to Florida as pets. Some pythons escaped and began reproducing in the wild. Their skill at hunting has decreased the number of wood rats and storks in the area. Here our caption reads, "A monkey holding a baby." It is important to remember that ecosystems can be complicated. Small actions might end up having a big impact. And that is the end.